There's an interesting problem that I've been dealing with today, and I partly my own my own stupidity, perhaps my own reluctance to do anything. But the question of medical negligence and the time limit placed on any form of legal action that alleges medical negligence, specifically this 3 year limitation period, which dictates that claims must be initiated within 3 years of the injury or the claimant's awareness of the harm. And while this limit may be legally binding, I think it is morally indefensible for several reasons. Not not least because literally today I finally got a letter. I finally got access to my medical records, and this time I got access to medical records which are basically correct. They haven't been tampered with, and there are letters there I have never seen, and one of which demonstrates absolutely and fundamentally why the why some of the errors that took place when I was under the knife for cancer surgery, why the treatment I was given was wrong, and and explains why I was bleeding then for a further 2 weeks afterwards, because I was given the wrong drug, um, because a particular diagnosis. I'm on the haemophilia scale, and all my life I found that every few years I get diagnosed with a different form of blood, of blood clotting or non-blood clotting disease. And this was one of these times. It happened just before my cancer diagnosis, and I was told that the that the disease that I had, the particular type of haemophilia that I'd had, was rescinded because I didn't have the correct gene count for that. Since then, I've I've acquired a new definition, a new diagnosis, but there was no question that I didn't have a serious blood disorder. The question was which one I had and what extent I had it. But the hospital took this as an opportunity not to give me the correct drugs, and they gave me something off the shelf, and it wasn't efficacious. And shortly after I came out of surgery, I started to bleed. Once I came home, I started to bleed badly, and I was then back in hospital for a further 2 weeks, bleeding a good half pint glass, maybe more, of blood every day, and that was quite frightening and quite disturbing, and completely something that didn't need to happen. Indeed, I'd spoken to the hematology people from my bed before I went into surgery, and I said, this is what I need. This is the drug I need. And I gave them a choice of, I think, two different drugs. And instead of giving me that drug, they gave me something off the shelf called tranexamic acid, which is pretty useless. And uh, and I wrote them a letter in December of 2021, and I eventually got a letter back, a long circular letter, which is full of justifications and half truths. And then I got the letter on which all this is based, and and I spoke to the hematology department, the haemophilia department in Oxford, today, and they said that they would send me a covering letter explaining absolutely that the letter which was being used as the basis of all this stuff was misinterpreted. A clear claim for negligence, except the information took place 3 years ago. The surgery took place over 3 years ago, and the letter that I got from the hospital was just over 3 years ago. So it's impossible to move forward. Now, from my point of view, I don't really care. I've sort of given up with trusting the NHS, and I wouldn't advise anyone to go to the hospital in Coventry. I would, I would regard it as a danger zone. It's not the first time I've suffered medical negligence for the same reason. I had my appendix out in 2011, and the hospital, which was then the John Radcliffe in Oxford, all it had to do was consult the Churchill, also in Oxford, part of the same trust, but they didn't. They did their own experiments to ascertain what sort of what sort of problem on the haemophilia scale that I suffered from. And I was busy telling them, but they didn't believe me. And they wasted 3 days, during which time my appendix burst, and the actual appendix operation was very dangerous, and I was in intensive care for 24 hours, and in great pain thereafter, because I'd been badly scarred. And when the various tubes were removed, they were green. And it wasn't until I had cancer surgery that I realised how badly hurt I'd been. And indeed, the consultant performing the surgery on me, had difficulty probing around because of the scarring that had resulted from the appendix operation. So again, another instance of neglect. But of course, I didn't know the details of that until I was under the knife for cancer. And then I had a conversation about, oh, please don't pull out this tube without giving me morphine because it hurts so much. And the consultant said, oh, don't be ridiculous. Here. And it came out so easily. I said, how does that come out so easily? And why isn't it green? And he seemed very surprised that I should have had tubes in my body when I had my appendix out that came out green. He said, obviously they were diseased, infected. Again, a sign of negligence. So I suppose I should recommend that you don't go to the John Radcliffe either. But why is this a moral issue? Medical negligence involves latent harm, where the effects of an error may only manifest years later, or you only realise them years later. And consider a patient misdiagnosed with a benign condition when in fact they have cancer. And the failure to diagnose could delay treatment, causing preventable suffering and in some cases death. Yet the clock starts ticking not at the point of discovery but the point of injury or reasonable awareness. And what constitutes reasonable awareness? How is a layperson supposed to identify negligence in complex medical contexts, especially when they rely on the very professionals whose errors have caused the harm? Take the point of a patient who undergoes surgery, suffers complications, and is assured repeatedly that the outcomes are normal. Only years later they discover that negligence caused their suffering, and by then the limitation period has expired, effectively barring their claim despite clear evidence of wrongdoing. But more than that, this legal sleight of hand perpetuates the negligence and perpetuates the bad practice. Then depression, grief, confusion often accompanies medical harm. In my case, I just couldn't face the thought of reading the letter that I'd been sent back. Even I'd found it torturous. And it was only in the last few days I actually read it. That further complicates the issue. It's morally unconscionable to expect someone grappling with severe trauma or mental health challenges to pursue legal action so promptly. For instance, parents whose child suffers a brain damage during a routine operation may spend years focusing on caregiving, not lawsuits. And the 3-year limit penalises their delay, turning a system meant to protect into one that punishes the vulnerable. Essentially, this is simply a way for the NHS to duck responsibility. Consider also the case of a single parent recently widowed due to a botched procedure, who's too overwhelmed by their circumstances to even contemplate legal recourse. Should we deny justice to those unable to navigate the labyrinthine legal system because of personal obstacles? The law says yes. The law was drafted in 1980. Beyond individual justice, the limitation period undermines real accountability, and negligence is often indicative of deeper institutional failings, overworked staff, inadequate protocols, the indifference of the system. By allowing technicalities like time limits to bar claims, we deny the opportunity to uncover these patterns and insist on improvement. And without improvement, without calling out the things that are wrong, we can't make anything right. And the case of the NHS child undergoing a tonsillectomy in 1960 illustrates this perfectly. It took over 2 decades and a serendipitous viewing of a TV programme for the family to uncover the concealed negligence. Had they been bound by strict limitations then, this grave injustice might never have come to light at all. While the law does provide exceptions, such as for minors or those lacking mental capacity, these carve-outs do not address the fundamental unfairness of the time limit. Moreover, reliance on judicial discretion to extend the limit period introduces uncertainty, and claimants must gamble on whether the court will grant leniency, a daunting prospect for those already facing immense hurdles. Even when a claim is time-barred, initiating legal proceedings to challenge the limitation defence involves significant costs and risks. A system predicated on such uncertainty deters many valid claims, effectively shielding negligent practitioners, negligent hospital trusts from real accountability. Critics argue that limitation periods provide necessary certainty for defendants, particularly in cases where proving causation is already complex. Yet certainty for one party shouldn't come at the cost of denying justice to another. A surgeon who causes harm through negligence has no moral right to be free from liability simply because time has passed. Limitation periods, while convenient for defendants, become weapons to avoid responsibility. And the solution is not to eliminate time periods entirely, but to make them more flexible. A robust system should balance fairness with practicality, ensuring that those unaware of their harm or unable to act are not arbitrarily barred from seeking redress. Perhaps the answer lies in extending the limitation period to 6 years, or providing automatic extensions in cases involving mental health challenges, bereavement, depression, complex diagnoses, evidence appearing late. We also need to challenge the culture of defensiveness in medical litigation. Rather than hiding behind procedural barriers, institutions should focus on learning from errors to improve patient safety. Accountability and transparency must be seen as allies of progress, not threats to reputation. The 3-year time limit in Britain is a blunt instrument that sacrifices justice for administrative convenience. It disregards the realities of human experience, where trauma, ignorance, and trust delay the pursuit of claims. By upholding this limitation, we risk perpetuating a system where negligence goes unaddressed, harm unacknowledged, lessons unlearned. If justice is to mean anything, it must be accessible to those who need it most, and that requires reforming laws that prioritise expedience over equity. And in the end, this is a good example of where justice falls short of morality, and the good is not done by justice. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I've now been hit twice by negligent experience in British hospitals. I've only ever been in hospital twice, and 3 times, because I had to go back into hospital because of the cancer and because of the bleeding. And I think I simply have to recognise that I cannot trust British medical support, and that makes me very worried. At the same time, I hear stories of whistleblowers who are treated with such disdain in the NHS. I listen to stories about people I know who are CEOs and bigwigs in hospital trusts who are treated with kid gloves when they themselves are accused of treating the real workers badly, of not paying properly, of ducking responsibility. If you duck responsibility to your workers, to the doctors, to the nurses, to the cleaners, then the likelihood is you're going to do the same thing to the patients. And I don't know what the answer is, because I don't want to be the person who takes legal case after legal case through against the NHS. I want to support the NHS, but at the same time, I know that it doesn't work, and I I don't know what the alternative is. The alternative, by the way, is not private medicine, and that in Britain is heavily dependent on the NHS. So maybe we're better off than the USA. Maybe, maybe, maybe we've just got tired. Maybe Brexit has killed off the last goodwill in medical care. I would like to see a transformation. I would like to see change. But the blunt reality is I don't feel safe. I'd love to know what you think. I'd love to know if you've got similar experiences. I suspect some people have, of medical negligence and the realization that you can't pursue it because the time limit's gone, and you wouldn't know how to. And I just feel very sad for other people who are in this position. The many people who are in this position, because the only winners here are the lawyers and the hideous managers who know that they're lying, and who know that they're cutting corners, and who know that care is not their primary concern.